Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Hadacek. I am a fifth-year PhD student at Davis, and this work is co-authored with Maylene Ma, who is here, and Rich Sexton, who is also here. So want to give credit where credit is due for this paper.
Con tiri d'artiglieria a lungo raggio e lanci di missili. Questa è notizia proprio di poco fa che arriva
So it's no secret that the resilience of the agricultural and food supply chain has been under question over the last couple of years, basically since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Small evidence is that there's about 20 different sections here at the AAEA conference about supply chain disruptions. And as well as that there have been reports by the USDA AMS, as well as the UN Food and Ag Organization about making the global food supply chain resilient, or the US food supply chain more resilient. And no matter if you believe the supply chain reacted well and adapted well, as our previous presenter just showed, it's no doubt that this is going to continue to be a policy question that policymakers weigh in the US and globally, is building a more resilient supply chain. And so in this paper, we tackle this by building a theoretical model to assess how different policy measures to improve resilience of the agricultural and food supply chain, how they impact both the economic efficiency and how they benefit resilience in the long run. And so in doing so, we hopefully contribute to some of these discussions that will continue to happen, no doubt, as we prepare for future extreme events, whether that's the Russia-Ukraine war, future pandemics, shipping container getting stuck in a canal somewhere in the world. And so the four main policy questions that we hope we do answer in this paper are how market power and antitrust enforcement impacts resilience of the food supply chain, how adding additional processing capacity can help sustain the processing of food during these extreme events, how the introduction of price controls like anti-price gouging laws impact consumers, processors, and producers, and then lastly, how diversifying production to more dispersed regions throughout the US, how that affects producers as well. And so since we only have a small amount of time today, I'm only going to focus on the first two, but you can go find the paper on my website if you want to read into this more. And so to assess these impacts, we use Monte Carlo simulations by introducing shocks into the system, and then assess how the welfare of farmers, of processors, and consumers are affected by these different policies. And so to do so, our base model, instead of showing you all of the math, I'll show you a simple supply and demand chart, but the market power and market structure of food and ag supply chains has often been cited as one of the reasons for the lack of resilience or the lack of response in times of extreme shock. And so to account for this factor, we use the flexible oligopoly and oligopsony model, whereas instead of assuming that markets and agricultural markets operate perfectly competitively, we allow some additional market power to influence what equilibrium outcomes are generated. And so to do so, we allow for a weighted average between fully monopolistic or fully monopsonistic markets, and we take the weighted average of both the marginal cost curve and then the supply curve, and then the marginal revenue curve and the demand curve. And so these parameters, theta and z, then determine the extent to which a market is concentrated. To just briefly motivate this further, if you assume Cournot competition in these agricultural markets, and think about like the beef processing sector, where we generally think that there are four big firms operating, Cournot competition would assume that Z and theta are equal to 0.25 in these cases. And so it's a slight rotation of the supply curve, and it's a slight rotation of the demand curve to find our equilibrium outcome. And so furthermore, we posit that during extreme shocks, the shocks to the system are non-random in the way that we're not introducing just random, normally distributed shocks into a system and into a model. And so as evidenced by the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw retail demand for beef increase dramatically, as much as 40% over the average, due to stockpiling and stockouts that we witnessed at the beginning of the pandemic, as well as processing plants were shut down and slaughter capacity was reduced by as much as 30%. And so these correlated and simultaneous shocks introduce this sort of scenario into this basic supply and demand model, where it's not only a shift in supply, but it's also a shift in demand, which unequivocally leads to higher prices in these markets. And depending on the size of the shock, it determines whether quantity increases or decreases. And so for our Monte Carlo simulations, we introduce 100,000 supply shocks, 100,000 demand shocks that are also correlated with each other to produce outcomes that are like this. And then as well as we introduce a plant shutdown probabilistic shock. So assuming that there's N plants in the system as a whole, N prime plants represents how many processing plants remain after the shutdown. And so all that to say then, as we conduct the 100,000 simulations, we see how mean welfare is affected by these different policies that we'll introduce. And then we assess the resilience of the supply chain measured by the coefficient of variation, which is the relative dispersion of these welfare outcomes, which is measured by standard deviation over the mean welfare measure. And so first, I mentioned this at the beginning, but we're going to assess how reducing market power in these markets impacts processors, consumers, and farmers. And so as we see on the left-hand side, is that there are resilience gains. We see the coefficient of variation decrease relative to our starting point, which is 0.3. Our parameters equal to 0.3. And then as those markets move more towards perfectly competitive, the coefficient of variation decreases for all of those markets as well. And then sort of typically, as we expect, whenever there's a reduction in market power, consumers and producers are benefited by this, and we see increases in mean efficiency measures by up to 200%, and then processor profit declines. Second, we measure how the entry of new processors impacts the ability of the supply chain to have the processing more dispersed over more plants, right? And so we see some marginal gains, again, in resilience by adding additional processors. And importantly here, we're also controlling for economies of scale. So as you add additional processing capacity, the costs on average are increasing in these markets. And so for this set of results, we assume Corno competition. And so not only are these markets is dispersed over more plants, but we're also seeing a reduction in market power, which is causing processors and farmers and consumers again to benefit. However, the result that this sort of hinges on this argument that we assume Corno competition. So if you don't assume Corno competition and just look at the impacts of how just being more dispersed affects the resilience, we see that actually all parties lose because of the economies of scale penalty. And so just to wrap it all up, we provide this theoretical framework that we can assess these different policy measures. And it's important to consider the nature of which shocks are introduced under extreme events. And some of these policies that have been introduced in the US, there's some justification that they provide more resilience to the supply chain, but importantly, they come at the cost of efficiency, and it's not always as straightforward as these always provide resilience benefits. So thanks. And yeah, you can check out the paper on my website if you're interested. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, chat. I don't think so. All right. All right, well, if there's no more questions, we can chat after if you think of anything later.
Stop sharing, make sure that you're sharing.
Let me share my screen. So do I have to share my screen now?
Go over to share screen.
Yeah, there you go. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being present here. I'm Madhuri Saripalli, and I'll be presenting my research on production, prices, and supply chain disruption among small farmers in India during COVID. This is a joint work with Vijaya Subramanian, who's also from Kriya University. So there's a lot of research on the impact of COVID on supply chain disruption, demand shocks, and the coping mechanisms used by various actors along the supply chain. And especially there's a limited information or limited evidence in the context of developing countries where the supply chain tends to be very vulnerable and highly complex because of the length and the presence of numerous stakeholders along the supply chain. So in this context, we wanted to do a case study of the rice farmers in South India, where they are presented with different types of markets, and each market is highly complicated and has its own inherent dynamics. So there are typically 3 markets where the rice farmers can go to. And one is the farm gate, where the traders or the agents come directly to the farmers and buy the produce. And second is the regional marketing committees, which is supported by the state government and which is based on an auction system, and where the price fluctuates every day based on the demand and supply. And the third market is the government supported, what is called as the procurement centers, where the government gives them guarantees a minimum support price for the farmers to protect them from these fluctuations in the prices, daily prices. So these are the 3 types of markets, and we look at all the 3 in detail and try to analyze the differences. And basically the 3 markets are characterized by 3 distinct factors. One is the distance, the other is the liquidity provided by each market, and finally the services provided by the agents in the supply chain. So if you actually look at this this entire supply chain, the 3 different supply chains, you can see that the first one, which is the farm gate, is the most liquid, because that's when the farmers can get ready cash for their produce immediately, although the prices are the lowest in this supply chain. But the second one is where they have a scope of getting very high prices because it's market-based, but there is also a possibility of collusion among traders. And the last one is what is the procurement centers, where the government guarantees a minimum support price. But these are often not in the reach of small farmers, because there is some documentation process involved in validating their identity and their production proofs and so on. So we interviewed the farmers along these 3 different supply chains, and to understand how these farmers who resorted to these different markets got impacted during the COVID. So we asked this question, first of all, was there a production disruption? And then we try to estimate the impact of socioeconomic and supply chain factors on the farmer's production decision, and basically the decision to return to farming, and the supply response across 3 different crop seasons. So to give you a background, there are 3 crop seasons, of which 2 are the most important crop seasons in India. One the monsoon, or which is known as the Kharif season, which runs from June to September. And then you have the winter, which runs from October to January. And these are the 2 important planting seasons. And then you have the summer season where farmers typically plant specialty crops like fruits and vegetables. So primarily, these are the two important seasons, the Kharif and the Rabi. That's when the major farmers plant their grains and pulses and rice and so on. So the first important data that I would like to show you is this table, which shows you the disruption caused by pandemic. So this is based on a survey of 200 farmers, which was done in the period of July 2020 to January 2021. And these farmers are small and marginal farmers, like holding almost less than 5 acres to 10 acres. So one can see, if you look at the columns 1 and 2, you can see that in the main monsoon season, which was when there was a lockdown, only 2%, roughly 2% of the farmers actually planted any crop. And similarly, if you actually saw another important, this column 3 and 4 actually shows you how the season got shifted or delayed by one season ahead. So farmers typically plant rice in the Kharif season, but if you see column 3, the percentage of farmers who planted paddy rice in 2020, that shifted to the winter season rather than the monsoon season. So there was a shift in the cropping pattern. So we try to analyze now what are the factors that influenced, because it's not easy to understand the farmers' decisions, in vacuum. You have to know the socioeconomic context. So the production decision we analyzed using a bivariate model, a biprobit model, because the decision to plant is interrelated, is not independent across seasons. And so what we get is very interesting result. We see that farmers, so let me just come to this important conclusions here. So what played an important role? Economic status. So production decisions were delayed by season, and small and marginal farmers and farmers who belong to the below poverty line status, they were more likely to resume only in the winter season. So they were the ones who were most affected. Farmers who had alternative income sources and who had opportunity to work outside the farm, they also were more likely to resume production. Sorry, less likely to resume production because they had alternative income. Infrastructure, so farmers with access to all-weather roads, and the markets, so farmers who actually resorted or who relied more on the market committees or the auction-based markets, they were more likely to bounce back. And one counterintuitive result that we get is farmers who travel to distant markets were more likely to produce during the lockdown. So which is sort of counterintuitive. So why should farmers who are more, why should distant markets be more accessible during COVID? So this actually sort of shows that something more than the markets is the access to markets that is more important. So more probably during COVID, the markets which are more distant were open compared to the markets which were closer. So we need to think more about this, and when we were interviewed farmers, they also sort of corroborated this in a sense that there were some agents who helped them to get to distant markets compared to some farmers who could not access the markets at all. Now, the last question that we try to analyze is the supply response, where we also look at the price. So once we throw in the price for analyzing the supply response, we use a Heckman selection model, because now we have the supply response estimates basically the impact of area under cultivation after taking into account the self-selection of farmers into production. So this is the regression equation, which is how much area they planted. And this is a selection equation, which said that how many farmers, first of all, decided to participate in the production cycle. And so your area under production is conditional on your participation in production. So we see that the price is definitely important. So the price acts as an important signal, and the previous season's price actually acts as an important signal for them to produce in this current season. But that's not the only important variable. We have the other variables like the markets, which also played an important role in bouncing back and deciding how much to produce. So this is my broad conclusion here. And There's some more interesting results that I would probably, there's not much time to share here, but then you're welcome to write to me and I'll share my paper with you. Thank you very much. Any comments?
How does price discovery work in these markets? Like, is there online?
Yeah, so in the auction markets, it's like the farmers have to physically go to that market and they get slots where they have to put the based on quality of the produce. And then there is the government official who actually gives you a piece of paper which tells you how many agents actually, how many traders actually, what is the bid they placed. And then this piece of paper is what the discovery of prices basically. So this is in the auction market, but in the procurement markets, that's a fairly transparent mechanism, which is online. So the government procurement centers publish their prices online, but the farmers who have access to those internet sources, only they can, they get to see it on time. Yeah.
Just wondering, were there some yield connected to yield production? So you mentioned that a lot of farmers postpone their production from into lockdown. Yes. I was just wondering, were there any production and then maybe follow up higher food prices in the next year?
Yeah, so the farmers are really very small farmers, probably their impact on the overall production is not going to be that big because these are very marginal farmers, like, just about 5 to 10 acres. It's very less. So if you were to really see this across, expand the sample and see it across the geography, then you probably will see an impact on the yields in a much more broader framework. That's what you asked.
I was just
The macro, looking at the macro picture, right?
Yeah. Well, wondering if you could
So there are, if you actually look at the big picture, the macro picture, also we see that the prices are actually pre-pandemic are actually higher compared to the post-pandemic. We look at the auction prices, the daily variations in the prices that come into the market, the daily market arrivals and the prices, daily price fluctuations in the market, regional market communities. And we see that there is the pre-pandemic prices were actually much higher compared to the post-pandemic. So we try to connect the dots. So there is definitely a welfare implication here in terms of, because if you really aggregate it, you can see what is happening in the big picture. The prices have got depressed post-pandemic. It's a highly dynamic process, and each market has its own dynamics. So, thank you so much. So.
So welcome to this lightning presentation. My name is Guy Lowe. I'm a PhD at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands, and my research is entitled Mixed Farming and Agroforestry Systems, a systematic review on the value chain implications. So time is short, so let's get straight to it. What is a mixed farming and agroforestry system, or a MIFAS as we'll call it hereafter? A MIFAS emerges from the principles of agroecology, which aims to increase the sustainability and productivity of agriculture while maintaining the environment. MIFAs are designed to capture the synergies between farming enterprises, such as livestock, forestry, and cropping, along temporal, spatial, and organizational axes. For example, here we have an integrated crop livestock system that combines cows and grain production. By exchanging grain for feed and manure as fertilizer, you can more easily close nutrient cycles. Additionally, leaving the crop residues for livestock to graze post-harvest or implementing pasture and cropping rotations are also forms of integration. Another nice example is the Montado System, which is an integrated livestock forestry system unique to the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. Here, woody perennials such as cork, oak, and olives are integrated with pigs, where the trees provide valuable products such as wood and fruit, and provide environmental services such as shade and wind buffers for the pigs to utilize. In turn, the pigs consume beneficial tree litter such as fallen acorns and olives, and also the weeds that may compete with trees for resources such as water, and their droppings contribute to the organic content in the soil. However, little research has been done on evaluating the economic performance of different MIFAs, particularly with respect to the value chain. And due to the diversity of systems employed, they have been very difficult to compare and contrast between MIFAs and also with specialized systems. Our research therefore had two principal objectives, the first of which was to examine and evaluate the potential value chain implications of MIFAs. And secondly, to operationalize MIFAs designs to facilitate the study of these said value chain implications. We performed a systematic review of the literature. We applied three inclusion criteria, the first of which was a geographic focus mainly on the developed West, so Europe, North America, Oceania. We used thematic analysis to identify, analyze, and report qualitative data extracted from the literature along some predetermined themes, which I'll get into in a moment. So as opposed to meta-analyses, we produced meta-narratives to tell the story of each theme so that we could take a much higher view, given that the literature was often very diverse and very little on the value chain itself. So we covered four main themes. The first was entitled Configurations, Design, and Coordination Management, where we focused on the value created as a result of the system design itself. So we mainly found that MIFAs exhibited reduced input requirements, such as fertilizer and pesticides, and had higher resilience against production risks. These were primarily due to the provision of ecosystem services through the synergies between enterprises. However, high capital, labor, and opportunity costs hinder value creation. Additionally, coordination between farmers at the landscape or territorial level can increase the benefits, but also provide additional challenges, namely in that you now need to have farmers coordinate with each other. The second theme concerned the farming environment. These were the factors that could influence value creation, but from the outside. We generally found that MIFAs had a greater environmental and ecological resilience, particularly against climate and weather risks, in addition to being better suited to utilizing marginal agricultural land than specialized systems. We found that there was inadequate public policy to support MIFA systems, and that they are vulnerable to economic trends such as a lack of succession or rural abandonment. Thirdly, we looked at ecosystem services valuation, which is pretty much that. We found that MIFAs had greater motivations social and ecologically, given that they are more ecologically friendly and also promote heritage landscapes and are more suited for touristic and additional value-added activities. However, limited consumer awareness for MIFAs products limited how much value of these ecosystem services can be transmitted along the value chain, and that ecosystem services themselves are not always internalized and are manifested as externalities. So they are effectively lost to the value chain. Fourthly, the last theme was supply and value chain integration. We found that MIFAs are much more limited in their integration in longer supply and value chains. This is primarily due to MIFAs being more diversified than specialized systems and lacking economy of scale or economy of specialization, which make it harder to interact with upstream and downstream value and supply chain actors. Using our results, we also proposed to operationalize MIFAs and their value chains. So we created what we called configurations in order to encapsulate what these systems and designs can look at in order to facilitate their study. So here in our configurations, we include value inflows and outflows. we set the MIFAS boundaries and indicate the various actors that participate within them, such as farm businesses. We further include where there is interconnectedness, so-called to encapsulate the synergies as well as the drawbacks of the farming enterprises and the actors that create value within the MIFAS. And we also include vertical integration within the system as a means to enhance value creation in the boundary. So I'll give some quick examples. So here we have a single farm MIFAS presented here by the poplar pigs in Denmark, where the farmer manages both poplars, the trees, and the pigs, allows these two systems to interact with each other, they interconnect. And through these the ecosystem services and the interactions between them, captures the value and then transmits them onto the wider value and supply chain as value outflows in the as the products. Here we have a multi-farm landscape MIFAS in the example that we saw earlier, crop and livestock system, where we can have, for instance, a livestock farmer and an arable farmer work together to create this interconnectedness between the enterprises. And they combine, create value and transmit it along the value chain. And here we can get a bit more complicated, where we now have a bit more integration with other value-added processes off farm. So here we have olives and pigs again. So we can imagine two separate farmers, but now they also cooperate in, say, extra processing, such as to create ham or olive oil, or to create ecotourism activities in order to capture more of those ecosystem services and the other socio-ecological values that can be created, but which are not always captured simply by the products that are coming out of the system. So we have explored in this research how the value chain can be impacted by MIFAS. MIFAS have many opportunities for value creation, such as by reducing some costs and improving resilience to risks. We have seen that ecosystem services are both a blessing for synergies and for their qualities, and a curse as much of the value is not always internalized and are manifested as externalities. We have also seen that the farming environment is also of key importance in determining whether MIFAS can compete in the wider food production environment. We find that very little is known, however, about the wider value chain implications. Increasing value chain research is important in order to inform better policy recommendations, farming strategies and designs, and market-driven incentives for MIFAS adoption. For instance, research is needed to support value creation, how to more equitably internalize social and ecological services, and to allow MIFAS to be more economically sustainable. I will skip this because mainly it's what we have already discussed, that we need more research to assess the value chain and resilience differences between MIFAS and contrast them with specialized systems in order to then be in a better position to propose recommendations for MIFAS. And that does it for me. You can contact me here. This project was also funded by the European project called Mixed, where you can follow more on this website. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. And yeah.
Maybe you can say a few words on the database that you have. Yeah, that's a very special system, and how can you assess that database there?
Well, the issue that we have is that a lot of the data is very anecdotal and not easily replicated across different systems. So the challenge was in doing our thematic analysis and trying to find a way of how to encapsulate all of this information. And we find that we need to first propose a means to study these systems so that we can more quantitatively assess them. So now that we have some kind of commonalities between MIFAS through our configurations, and where we have now also pinpointed where value can be created and assessed, then that's what we propose we should do. Because at the moment, there is very, very little done on that. And a lot of it focused on the environmental services as a result of these, of the integration between enterprise. So there's very little on economics or on the value chain itself. So it's a big limiting factor here. And if that's all, then I leave it to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Gotta have it for the Zoom audience. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Hill, and I'm a master's student from Kansas State University. And I worked with this project on with Dr. Alex Shenoyan and Dr. Greg Aldrich. And our research is looking at the animal protein-based ingredients in pet food and analyzing the supply chain and market drivers. So this was done as part of my thesis research. And so the motivation behind this research is that pet food is a rapidly growing industry, both globally and in the United States. And we can see that by looking at this chart showing pet food expenditure. And if you look over the last 9 years, we can see that globally, this expenditure has increased 115%. And in the US, it has increased 71%. And looking at the breakdown of the types of ingredients that are making up pet food, we can see that animal-based protein ingredients make up 38% of the ingredients being used in pet food, which is a significant portion. And so what we can see that as this industry continues to grow, the need for these ingredients used in pet food will grow alongside that. And so basically there's two ways that we can go about increasing the availability of animal-based protein for pet food. And so that's either by switching to alternative or novel sources of protein, or making better use out of the ingredients that we're currently using. However, there are issues with both of these. So for example, if we were going to switch towards novel or alternative proteins, there can be issues with regulatory challenges and gaining acceptance from consumers. And then the issue with trying to do more with the ingredients that we're already using is that we don't have a very well-rounded understanding of the supply chain to figure out how to make better use out of these ingredients. And so the problem being evaluated in this research is that the need for animal-based protein ingredients is increasing alongside the increase in the demand for pet food. However, the supply of these animal-based protein ingredients is based off of slaughter for human consumption. So people aren't going out there and slaughtering livestock for the protein to be used in pet food. Instead, they're taking the byproducts that are generated from production from human food to be used in the pet food. And so in order to understand how to make better use out of these ingredients, we need to have a better understanding of the current market situation. So the objective of this paper was to gain an insight on the animal-based protein supply chain, specifically for use in pet food. And this was done using a three-pronged approach. So first, by estimating the differences in the ingredient and supply growth rates of animal-based protein for pet food, and then mapping out how these ingredients flow from the human food supply chain into pet food, and then finally identifying inefficiencies throughout the supply chain and areas of opportunity to increase availability. So we'll start by comparing these two growth rates. And ideally, we would have had data available on the volume of animal-based protein used in pet food versus the volume available for pet food. However, this information is not available, so instead we use proxies to make these calculations. So if you look at the red line, that's showing the US produced pet food in units. And the way that we calculated this was by taking the expenditure of pet food in the US, subtracting the value of imports and adding the value of US exports. So that gives us the value of pet food being produced in the US. And then that can be divided by the average per unit price of pet food to give us how many units are being produced. And then we can compare that to the growth rate of livestock for human use. And so the reason that that makes sense is because these animal protein ingredients are being derived from these livestock. And so looking at this chart, you can see that US produced pet food is growing at a faster rate than the livestock production. So that means that there could be a point in time where there's no longer enough animal-based protein available for use in pet food. So that leads us to wanting to understand the supply chain. So the supply chain, it starts out with the human food supply chain. So this would just be like the production of livestock. And then at each stage in that supply chain, there are different byproducts being generated that can then go to intermediary processing activities. And so these are the activities that are taking the byproducts and then turning them into ingredients that can be used in pet food. And then those ingredients can either go to brokers, which are like a middleman to facilitate trade between those intermediary processors and pet food manufacturers. And then we've got 3 streams of types of ingredients going throughout this supply chain. So we've got ready to use ingredients that are don't require any further processing, and then 2 other streams that can take various routes before they end up as ready to use ingredients in pet food. And so then next, we spoke with people from the industry to talk about some of the supply chain challenges that they were facing. And so one of them being labor shortages, which could then also lead to upstream supply chain issues. So for example, when there's a challenge in like the processing or slaughtering, that leads to issues with the availability of those byproducts for the intermediary processing. And so some ways to potentially overcome those would be programs for employee retention or automating some of the production so that it would reduce the need for labor. And then another issue is the opportunity cost of raw materials. So a lot of these byproducts have uses in other industries as well. And so if they're more valued in a different industry, that will be taken out of the supply chain for pet food. And so one way to overcome that could be to utilize areas of products that aren't currently being used in pet food. So for example, there are companies looking into utilizing supermarket waste in pet food. And then lastly, there's a lack of market price information. So unlike other areas of agriculture where there's a market price so people know what their products are worth, this is not available in pet food, primarily due to the fact that it's a very privately held industry. And so one thing you could do would be to develop a method to estimate these prices to see what the value of your products are. And then one opportunity that has just recently come about is human grade. So in past, people would market their pet food as human grade, but that did not actually have a standardized definition until recently when AFCO, the regulatory body, created a definition. And so these products will fetch a higher value due to the humanization trends that we see in pet food, and it creates new opportunities for efficiency gains along the supply chain. So in order to be called human grade, it's got to be basically handled in the same manner that anything for human consumption. So it's got to be in a USDA facility. So combining some of these activities throughout the supply chain into a USDA facility would increase the value of those ingredients for pet food. And so we can see that animal-based protein is not growing at a fast enough rate to meet the availability required for pet food. And understanding the supply chain can help identify new opportunities in pet food to overcome this issue. Thank you for your time. I'll take any questions. All right, thanks guys.
Good morning, everyone. I'll introduce myself again. I'm Austin Harthorn. I'm a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm here today to present my research based on the value that ethanol plants bring to the individual corn grower in Nebraska. And I'll just get right into it. So observing the link between ethanol and the corn grower, corn is the primary feedstock for ethanol production, of course. And with ethanol production having a very large capacity in the US, they have the capacity to consume over 40% of national corn supply. Corn growers really stand to benefit from ethanol production in the area. However, the ethanol or that valuation really depends on where the corn grower is located relative to the plant. They may be able to achieve a better price elsewhere from grain elevators or other grain buyers in the area, and they may, as a result, they may derive no value from ethanol production in that scenario. But they also have to consider if there is an ethanol plant somewhat close, they have to consider if it's worth the cost to haul there. If it's too costly to haul there, they may actually be able to get a better net price in a different location. So to estimate that value for different farms, we can compare what net prices are available for that specific location to each grain buyer around them. And then net price is simply a factor of just the grain bid that can achieve the grain buyer less the transportation costs associated with delivering there. And comparing the net price that the farmer can get by going to the ethanol plant to the net price they can, or the best net price they can achieve anywhere else, you can kind of arrive at what that individual farm location attributes to the value that they attribute to ethanol production. So kind of how we go about this, we base our approach off of the McNew-Griffith 2005 model. In their model, they assume all corn production to occur along the line segment, ranging from 0 to 1 here. So all corn growers are located along that line segment. In this example, they have one option for where they can deliver, the terminal market located at the end of the line segment at D equals 1 there. The terminal market offers a grain bid, we call it PD here, and all producers located along the line segment receive a lesser price due to the role of transportation cost associated with delivering to the terminal market. And as you move away from the terminal market, that price that the producer receives is gradually lesser and lesser due to transportation costs. In a similar model, our model here, corn growers are again located along a line segment ranging from 0 to 1, with all corn production occurring along that line segment uniformly. In our scenario, we have 3 grain buyers rather than just the one that the McNew-Griffith model introduced. In this example, 2 grain elevators and then an ethanol plant located in between the 2. So in this scenario, before there was 1 net price available to the producer, there are 3 net prices available to the producer, and you can see each of these lines here represents a net price. For those producers located close to the ethanol plant, they can achieve some combination of a higher grain bid that the ethanol plant offers and possibly a reduced transportation cost from not having to deliver to the grain elevators. And in that advantage, or in that value that those farmers get from the ethanol plants is the valuation that they tie to local ethanol production. It's that net price they can achieve at the ethanol plant less than that price they can achieve at any other location. And you can see producers located close to the ethanol plant all derive a different value from ethanol production. So we can consider this practically in an actual spatial system. We consider the case for Nebraska, spatial systems consisting of 1 ethanol plant and 3 grain elevators. And using those grain buyers in that region, we can estimate net prices to individual farm locations within the region based on the grain bids and transportation costs that the farmers are facing in that specific region. And based on those, you can find the value, again, the value of ethanol production by finding the net price advantage by delivering to the ethanol plant versus delivering anywhere else. This is kind of details the farm locations that we estimate ethanol value for within our model here, placing it on our model, and then also an example of one of the maps of the regions that we use to estimate farm ethanol value. In our model here, we estimate 4 different farm location conditions for each ethanol plant and grain elevator combination. So that's why there's 8 farm locations located along this model chart here. The first farm location considered is the near the ethanol plant farm. We then also consider a farm location that's located exactly between the 2 grain buyers, one that's located near the grain elevator, and then also one that's located on the other side of the grain elevator in relation to the ethanol plant. And see that there. And then on the map, you can also see that there are 3 grain buyer locations, the red triangles there, and the ethanol plant, the star in the middle. And there's farm locations based off of those grain buyer locations. If maybe it's a little hard to see, but you can see farm locations 1 through 4. Farm location 1 represents the near the grain elevator farm. Farm location 2 represents the one that's between, 3 the one that's beyond, and 4 the one that's near the ethanol plant. And that's consistent with the other 2 grain elevators as well. Quickly going through where our data came from, we estimate net prices, and it's a simple figuration of grain bids and transportation cost. The grain bids come from DTN, just a data analysis and data delivery resource, and then the transportation costs come from a USDA MS report, the Grain Truck and Ocean Advisory. The grain buyer locations that we selected were based on variation in location within the state of Nebraska, and also in comparison with each other, the grain buyers. Variation in production capacity and storage capacity for the grain elevators, and variation in corn bid, what they usually offer. The farm locations that we chose were based on those 4 different farm locations, and those were consistent across all the regions that we considered. And that was a simple Google Maps finding a GPS coordinate that matched those farm location conditions. And these are the results that the primary results that we found. In this main figure here, these are in terms of ethanol premium. So each data point represents the net price advantage that a farmer achieves at the ethanol plant versus anywhere else. So this is the overall figure here on this left side, on your left side here. And you can see this line is at 0. Most farm locations that we considered were able to achieve a better price at the ethanol plant. And then we can also break it down by proximity with the 4 farm location conditions that we consider. Looking first at the beyond grain elevator condition, most were actually able to get a better price at the grain elevator, although around 40% of farms were able to drive by the grain elevator directly and still achieve a better price at the ethanol plant. The near grain elevator scenario is similar. Actually, more locations, though, are able to achieve a better price at the ethanol plant, around 52%. And considering the other 2 farm locations, those located in between the 2 grain buyers and those located next to the ethanol plant, almost in every case was the farmer better off delivering to the ethanol plant. And kind of some conclusions and key takeaways here that I kind of want to reinforce. The corn growers benefit very much from ethanol production, very much depends on their location, where they are relative to the plant. Past studies have considered more of the average impact of ethanol production, considering one figure overall for an area, the representative corn grower as it was. Here we consider the heterogeneous corn grower, a diversely located corn grower that is subject to different sets of grain bids and unique transportation costs to their specific area. By comparing the net prices available in any location, you can find what the farm's present value is of ethanol production if it exists. And then in this study, concluding, we find that most farm locations did obtain a higher price at the ethanol plant and did have a positive valuation of ethanol. And that's all I have. For any questions now or later.
I'm curious if you thought about like where ethanol plants themselves choose to locate, like what's in their objective function for where they locate, like, and I guess secondly, and sort of relatedly, what would happen if like all corn growers are not evenly distributed, you know, like sort of linearly, and so like an ethanol plant maybe locates itself in a concentration of ethanol.
Yeah, I can go back to. So an ideal location for ethanol plant to locate would be a corn surplus area, and in this specific model that we consider, it would be right here at this line where they could maximize their corn reach and yeah, the price that they receive for. Yeah. What was your second question? I'm sorry.
Like if corn growers weren't uniformly distributed,
yep.
You know, whatever it's say, your left hand side to middle, like if it was more of a like non-linear around the ethanol plant, because the ethanol plant chooses to locate where there's a cluster.
Yep. And yeah, that's a hard assumption in this model, and very much depend on kind of which direction they are more where there's a greater concentration. If there's a greater concentration on this side of this boundary here, it'd be ideal for maybe the ethanol plant to be located where they are currently. That's just something that ethanol plant would need to consider. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so something related to what you were asking about. This is something like the Portland's linear city model, right? So, but yes, so my question was similar that, you know, on what basis to the ethanol producers decide where to produce? And is there something like a maximum differentiation, minimum differentiation, and where do they get the maximum profits? So as you said, equidistant, right?
Yep, at this boundary here between, and this changes based on the grain bids that the elevators are offering and their location, where they're located along the line. Maximum benefit for that ethanol plant would be if it's uniformly, if the growers are uniformly distributed along the line, to be located at this point right there. This is just an example of something we considered for the ethanol plant to be located equidistant between the elevators.
So do you have a theoretical model? But maybe that's
I do not have a theoretical model showing where it is ideal for the ethanol plant to locate now. I guess that's the situation. If it's uniformly distributed along, if the growers are uniformly distributed along the line, that's where it is. But yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think we had a 7th speaker. I'm not sure, John from NCA&T. I don't think he's here. So otherwise, if anyone else wants to talk about anything else, we can let you go free early. So yeah.
You should get a prize for being ready.
Yeah. Good job, everyone. Thanks for sharing your research and for everyone that watched you. So. Okay. Yeah, I'll leave that. Let's close this. I am. Yeah.
Okay, I'm from Kansas. So, but just like south of the Nebraska border.
South Central.
Yeah. So north of Kansas.